You've been an amazing audience till now. I've been sitting at the back listening to everybody. It's been absolutely inspiring to listen to all the stories. And as my panel comes on, I just want to quickly introduce them and jump straight in. Catherine Goulart is the CEO of RATP. Estelle Brashlinov is the COO of Veolia. Pascal Cerise is the CEO of Thales International, and Connie Reimers-Hild is the Executive Director of the Rural Futures Institute at the University of Nebraska. This whole session, I know, is about future cities and designing future cities and reorganizing every organization, every stakeholder to think for the future. One of the big questions for me has always been, how do companies do that? When we don't know how fast technology is going to move, and we can't predict what it's going to do in 2 years, how do you build cities that are going to last for 100, 500, 1,000 years? So before we get started, I want to get your opinions on how you live today. How many of you here are frustrated when you go to work in the cities that you live in? Raise your hands if you get really frustrated while heading to work. I'm glad to see the hands go up, because I was like, where do you all live? How many of you think that your productivity would be better if you led a more flexible working life? I think with that, we can really get started with this panel. So I'm going to start off with you, Catherine. The question that comes up from that entire hands up situation is, what does the future city really look like to you? And to all of you, do you think in 10-year timeframes, 50-year timeframes, 100-year timeframes?
I think in the RATP Group we are international presence in 14 countries in 4 continents. And the reality is that we look around 20 years ahead, at minimum. For many reasons. The first one, it is that we are not only operating mobility. Today we transport people through 12 modes, not only tube, buses or tram, but also by carpooling, car sharing, making by some, let's say, agreement with startup in order to do so. But we are also builders of pieces of cities, and people do not know that we are able to include in industrial, for instance, pieces, public services, social housing. Just to take an example, we will build 2,000 social housing in Paris for the mayor of Paris, between now and 2024. So the vision that we have at RATP Group is the following. We want to be obviously a leader in mobility operations, but also the privileged partner of smart cities. And I will kill right away the idea of the smart cities, because we want an inclusive and human city. And in order to do that, we obviously need to first contribute to diminish the pollution and the congestion on one side, but also having the ability as a public service to promote diversity. Don't forget that the metro, for instance, the tram is one of the rare pieces where all the people gathered together. And it's for that that I am a fervent promoter of culture in the public transport, and we do so. We have, for instance, a photography prize every year, poetry in the metro. So, you know, my vision is really to embed that, not only public transport, but diversity, inclusivity.
Across the board.
Across the board. Just to start and to throw the ball, I think it's important because when we call smart cities, we think about the technology, but at the end of the day, my business is to get back to all these people time in order for them to take the time to do something else.
Estelle?
Okay? So it's a
let's pick up on
it's
that
a paradox. It's a paradox, but it's a very important point.
It is very important, and we'll pick up on that because I want to give Estelle a chance to jump in here, because when you talk about smart cities, I want to hear her vision as well, because you're doing a lot of work to try and it's almost the background noise that we don't pay attention to until it breaks down.
Yeah, so I guess, to answer the same question, like my dream city of the future is actually a circular one. Circular meaning, instead of the take, make, dispose model that we see today, we would go more circular and use everything which is wasted and make it a resource again. So let's call it a Galileo moment where we discover suddenly that the Earth is not flat, but it's actually round. There is an element of that. So it, of course, makes the city more sustainable, saves resource, it's a CO2. We've heard that in another panel this morning, so it's absolutely critical. To your question about is it now, is it 10 years, is it a dream, is it in 20 years? I think, the good news is we already have part of the solution, so let's act now. And, just duplicate the solution which works. We can save 10% of the CO2 gap just by being more circular with existing solutions.
And what does your vision look like for these future cities? What will they do that are so different from the cities of today?
What about I take a few examples? You were wondering what my samples were.
So she's been flashing this little bottle and refusing to tell me what it is. If you can hold it up, because the folks at the back can see it.
When you talk about circular economy and, turning waste into a resource, that's an example. So it's just a little something, there is 1,000 euros content here. So it's not inexpensive. Actually, it's a palladium. So palladium is used into microchips and stuff like that, and jewelry as well. Actually, this palladium, we found it in street sweepings. So we are literally urban mining our cities with a lot of process behind. So there is R&D, and you can imagine an investment. That's one example. And the reality is it's happening here and now. So it's not tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. We just have to do it now. Another example, that's a red chip. It looks like just a plastic one if you were to have it with you. It's actually plastic, a standard plastic, except it's not made out of oil. It's made out of human sludge. So the wastewater treatment plants, those big, big bits which usually are outside the cities, you can turn this sludge into plastic. That's an alternative. And again, this is an existing thing. So about your, do I have to choose between the future and the present? Both.
Both. What would you say, Pascal? What's your vision of the future city?
Well, when we look at what future cities will look like, actually we have to take several horizons. If you strictly look at infrastructures, building districts, etc., obviously you need to take into account a longer period of time, and typically I totally support what Catherine said about 20-year vision, that is good. But when you look at the types of solutions that will be deployed in the city, and in particular the impact of digital technologies, you need to take a much shorter time frame. And our view of future cities is that they will be revolutionized by digital technologies. Digital technologies will actually make it possible to evolve from a design approach in the past that was more targeting economic benefits for the society as a whole to a much more human-centric approach, now focusing on citizen needs, citizen behaviors, and enhancing their quality of life and focusing on their experience in their daily lives. So why is Thales interested specifically in smart cities? People sometimes look at Thales and think of Thales as a defense group. Actually, defense is half of our activities. All the rest is in the civil sector. We work a lot in the field of ground transportation. We're happy to work with RATP in particular. We work in the field of security, in the field of aerospace, satellites, but the thing to have in mind is think of Thales as a technology group. We have invested heavily in digital technologies just to take into account the very recent past, over the past 3 years we have invested about 7 billion euros in artificial intelligence, big data analytics, connectivity, cybersecurity, and of course these technologies are very meaningful to design smart cities. When you look at the impact of digital technologies on the design of cities, you need to take typically two angles. One is what kind of services can be brought to citizens, and how will the interaction of citizens with the city be transformed. And obviously, this citizen interaction with urban services will in the future involve much less human beings, but rather be handled through digital interfaces. And this obviously needs to take a human-centric view. You need to design citizen applications, smart city applications that corresponds to user needs, what people need to have, and you need to specifically work on the interfaces themselves, make them user-friendly.
I do want to pick up on that in just a minute, but I want to get Connie's view, because she brings a slightly interesting perspective here, which sometimes gets left behind. We talk about how the world will be urbanized by 2050, and 70% of the population will live in urban centers. But Connie, in your view, since you look at the rural part of the world, which rarely gets talked about with the technology and the digital interfaces, what is that future smart city viewpoint, in your opinion?
Well, I think this is a great question. You know, I am the Executive Director and Chief Futurist at the Rural Futures Institute, which is located at the University of Nebraska. And we focus on three major pillars to really shape that future. One is the rural-urban, not divide, but connection. You know, through the conference and the summit, we've talked a lot about sustainability and what that looks like. But what we need to realize is that urban and rural are tightly intertwined. Right, so the clothes we're wearing, the food we enjoy, that comes from rural. And even flying into Paris, I was able to see a lot of the fields outside of the city. And you know, that's where everything we use comes from, essentially, or most of the things we use comes from. So we can't leave the rural sector behind. And we really believe in the future. We are starting to see a shift where people don't want to just live in the urban centers, but actually want to live in centers that sort of bridge urban and rural. We call them micropolitan communities. So you have sort of the luxuries and the accessibility of urban, but you also have the quality of rural. We also focus on technology, and much like this panel has talked about, we've heard through the conference, you know, technology is the great equalizer, but we also know that with rural areas around the world, these are the last people to be connected. They're some of the last people to have that access. So, you know, partnerships are huge for us, and one of our great partnerships is with Microsoft, who is a sponsor of this conference, and I see Shelley McKinley right there. We actually hosted.
That's a good plug.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a great connection, because we as universities can do a lot of research. But you know, we need these partnerships really to advance our knowledge. And when they launched the Rural Broadband Initiative, their Airband initiative, we were super excited, because we knew that a company was really boldly saying, you know what, we see the importance of this around the world, but also in the United States. You know, as an institute, we focus on Nebraska. Of course, we want the impact to happen there, but it's also a national and international issue. And the third pillar we focus on, including the rural urban, the technology is leadership, because we are going to need different leadership to forge that future. You know, as a futurist, you put together multiple possibilities, and then we have to help leaders decide which one to pursue and give them the tools and thinking to do it.
Well, I know we're going to pick up on this conversation, but I want you all to think of a few questions that you want to put to this panel, because that's what this is all about. The questions you have and the way you can go back to your different organizations and implement some of the changes that are going on in these organizations themselves. So I will come to you when I do. Housekeeping rule: introduce yourself, your organization, and keep your questions quite short. I'll take them 3 at a time. Our lovely mic handlers are somewhere in this room, and they'll come find you. Let's pick up on that human angle, if I can put it to all of you. How do you bring the human angle when you're also balancing corporate strategy and corporate need? Yes, please.
Okay.
And women specifically, yeah?
And women, well, okay, so if you turn at the top, So my exec committee is parity. 50% men, 50% women, okay? And some of them are here. So I think when we discuss of this, we must be serious, we must act on them. I love speaking, like any French, I prefer action, okay? So this is one. And it's complicated in a company like us because obviously we have a lot of, RATP is a operation in mobility, but we are building metros line. We are also doing very heavy maintenance operation. It's my great pleasure to have somebody at the top of the organization, which is super good. She's in the room. She is a woman, but she's very, very small in terms of percentage of the organization of maintenance. And I think the school needs to play a key role on that, because the girls at 12 or 13 never imagined that they could run one day all the maintenance of the RATP group. So we need to tell the story, and obviously to help the young girls to enter into this profession. Saying that, I think that vis-à-vis the vision of the city, what we are trying to explain to everybody, and we love to work with Thales and Veolia, for instance, this is an ecosystem. For instance, you have in Paris, you talk about circular economy, and we have an experience today in the 12th neighborhood of Paris with various actors in which we are trying to circularize totally the waste, the economy, the energy management, and so on. And I think it's tomorrow a vision where the various actors need to play together in part of the cities in order to make the things happen. Because sometimes it is difficult to do it by one go, by yourself. You need to have a partnership with some big other corporates and say, okay, we design a part of the city in which we apply your vision in a way that you express. So we need to be concrete. We need project in order to demonstrate to people that is possible. Okay, yeah. And I think we are partnership with some of the big corporates there, and it's very important to in fact prove it by examples.
I wanted to ask both of you as well the question where you were talking to me earlier about how even in digital, if you don't make it about humans, and if you don't bring in all of the actors, it tends to create biases within artificial intelligence that will end up running a lot of these systems. Tell me a little bit more about how do you make that system more human and inclusive?
Yes, it's very important when you design future cities to actually involve groups of people that are sufficiently diverse in terms of gender, in terms of age, in terms of background, professional experience, because you need to capture the needs of everyone. But I would say more specifically, when looking at the goal of digital technologies require the involvement of everybody. With big data analytics and artificial intelligence, the objective is to gather a lot of information to actually be able to describe behaviors and also predict behaviors. And if this work of gathering, analyzing information, and processing information through artificial intelligence is performed by people who are not sufficiently diverse, in fact, this creates unconscious biases, and we can see that the resulting digital models then become biased. And this has been measured in a number of studies that have looked at the models resulting from big data analytics and artificial intelligence, and that they've seen that unfortunately women were not sufficiently represented, and there was a sort of men-oriented bias in these models. So that needs to be corrected, particularly in a city, because of course half of the citizens are going to be women. So what do we do at Thales to address this? Of course, it's a question for everybody, all the stakeholders, as you said, the whole ecosystem. We have taken very aggressive objectives to increase the representation of women in Thales, particularly increase the number of women in management layers, but also hire a lot of women in the digital field. By the way, in our digital teams, we have identified the way to attract and hire many women, so that's very good. But in addition to that, when you look at what is required to be successful in the digital field, you do not only need technologists. You also need to represent the user view, the user experience, and this requires other types of competencies. It's important for the ecosystem to gather that to design cities. It's important for a company like Thales to gather it as well. So we are focusing a lot on this. Unfortunately, we have not reached this parity level that
well, let's give another round of applause there, then.
Has demonstrated, but we are progressing. Not sufficiently quickly, but at least we are motivated to make good progress in the right direction.
There you go. Tell me something, Estelle. What do you see when we talk about the consumer interface and women not being included, the biases that happen in technology? From your perspective, how do you fix that?
So I guess two things on this human angle. If you're not careful, designing cities looks like designing infrastructure. If you take male on board only, they will design infrastructure, so it's good and nice, but it's not sufficient, because the question is, how do you leave the city as opposed to just design the infrastructure? And then you go to the usage, you go to the consumer, you go to the customer, in cases of companies. And it tends to be that women understand that more than the typical male white engineer over 50, which we have in all organizations. We think infrastructure, capex, building things. So there is an element of that. Digital for Veolia in cities is avoiding spending in more infrastructure. We have a lot of examples where, by putting data and sensors, we delay the investment in this and that because you operate more efficiently what you've got already. The second bit is the human angle, because you really have to use what you've got and to motivate people to go into using it. Say recycling, it's not all and good to say you should recycle. How do you do it really? Is it just a question of communication and do it more? No, you have to understand what motivates people to go into, say, circular economy, for instance. And we've discovered two trends here, two very powerful ones. One is the village, and the other one is the benchmark. Village, as in, even if you live in a large city such as Paris or London or New York or whatever, people love to have a village approach around them, like my neighborhood, with people I can relate to, with the bar around the corner and my neighbors and all the rest. And if you talk about that, as opposed to just the city as a whole, it tends to be a lot more powerful. The second thing we've seen is actually the benchmark. There was a wonderful experiment in California, I think, about trying to motivate people to have their air conditioning at 20 degrees as opposed to 18 degrees. You've all been in the US where you find it's freezing cold when you enter a meeting room, I'm sure, and you're like, how is it? Why? People are used to this type of temperature. This is strange. So they've tried the motivation by it's good for the planet. You know what? Didn't work, really. They've tried, if you have the air conditioning at 20 degrees, it's good for your wallet. You would spend less money, it works a little bit, but not that much. Actually, and they've tried your neighbors, as in the neighboring city or the neighboring village, has successfully spent, 20% less CO2 and all the rest of it by doing it. You could do the same. It did work. There is an element of comparing and benchmarking and use this kind of, I wouldn't say competition, but it's possible type of approach. Joneses. So I think, and we're talking human here. We're not talking about building different things, but using it differently.
You wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I want to include myself in, to be inclusive and to give two concrete examples of what we are doing.
Yes,
Sorry
please.
to come back a little bit on that, but I would like to explain to people our vision through two concrete examples. The first one is already done, multiplied by 12 in the next let's say, 10 years, we designed bus depot, electric bus depot, zero emission, because for us it's a huge, obviously, challenge. 69% of the emission is coming from the bus. And we have a very strong program to be zero emission bus depot 2025 in Paris, and I will tell you the impact will be huge, minus 50% of gas emission for our group. We already get rid of 5% of this 50 with our effort during the last 18 months. What we are doing an electric bus depot on which we plug on it vertically, vision, a kindergarten. So you have 180 buses and you have 93 babies on top. On that, you have social housing, 160. This project is already done. Huh? And 100 private property that I have sold to Eiffage, which I repaid 80% of my industrial investment in the bus depot. This is RATP, okay? And tomorrow we will do with other partners in Pleyel, in the north in Paris, for the Olympic Games, a neighborhood where all together we will create a park of 7,000 meters, theater, cultural center, a bus depot with the same, let's say, profile. Mm-hmm. This is what we need to do. All the people that have in their hand the ability to do that need to integrate the vision and think about inclusivity and mixity, because what I'm talking is private housing, social housing, public service, industrial, everything mixed together.
And I think that really does bring up the point which, Connie, you were talking about as well, and the audience at the start also highlighted that they would love that flexibility, to have the childcare available, to have the ability to travel when needed, and the bus depot makes it easier. When you look at the micropolitan, what are the ideas that you walk away? I know you were in Japan, you had some interesting observations of what they're doing, because they're dealing with yet another challenge we have, which is of an aging population.
Yeah, that's right. I just spent 10 days in rural Japan because their government has declared rural revitalization a national priority. I think this is something that other governments should really take a look at, including that of the United States, because they're realizing that 25% of their population is over the age of 65. And so it's aging rapidly. They're seeing a lot of depopulation, but they're also seeing, Tokyo continuing to grow. And it's growing so quickly, they're trying to figure out, how does that city look? But I think the other piece of this is rethinking the city or community just in general. Why are we still focusing on planning cities where you're driving to work, going physically shopping, even education? You don't have to drive there anymore, and in the future it'll be less and less. So how do we redesign cities and even houses to really think about what that future looks like? Entrepreneurship has been a theme through this conference. We know that in rural areas specifically, entrepreneurship is a huge economic driver and will be more so in the future, but that also means we need those entrepreneurs to be connected to urban markets and centers to sell online. But right now in the United States, we actually have a glut of infrastructure. Massive companies are closing. They don't need their physical store anymore. What they really need is that virtual presence. And so I think this is part of the question around design, right? This is like, okay, can I have my life at home in a more robust way? So perhaps I have my business there. My kids are also helping as part of the business. So they're learning entrepreneurial skills from a very young age, which is very important. Mm-hmm. I can shop and access almost anything I need online. And this will continue to improve as technology improves. So I think as we talk about the future, it is live where you want to live, be who you want to be, and that can be urban, that can be rural, that can be that micropolitan area in the middle. But the thing that universities bring to that are the students. As well, when Shelley was on campus, we actually hosted a Futures Female forum, and we had students from the tech sector at that forum. And they were thinking about the future and designing for this future. But what those young students, female students, asked Shelley most was how do I deal with a mostly male culture? You know, a male-dominated field. How do I do that? They weren't even really thinking about design and reinventing communities and cities. They were more concerned about that question. So I think part of it is redesigning what that future community or city looks like. The other part is to make sure we're getting women's voices in that pipeline that's been talked about, but more than that, making sure we're paving a path. And that means connecting with people that are here and helping them learn.
I want you to pick up on that.
Yes, picking up on what you just said, Connie, I think what we could have in mind for the future cities design is that designing it adequately with a human-centric view can really help reduce gender gaps and create more inclusive cities. Typically, when you look at gender gaps, there are two typical hurdles that make it more difficult for women. One is time constraints, and the second one is security. And I personally travel very much all around the world. I have lots of discussions with many large cities everywhere. Actually, these two issues are essential. And by using digital technologies, giving access to digital services, you completely transform the way time dedicated to transportation impact the life of citizens in general and women in particular. So for all the jobs in which you find much fewer women, that are jobs that usually involve huge requirements in terms of flexibility, in terms of availability, if you can work differently without the need to go to a physical place to work, which is sometimes very far away, but you can handle many more things through digital services, it will help women. The other point is obviously security. There are challenges in a number of large cities, making it very difficult for women to use public transportation late at night. And by increasing security and also making it possible to work from home, by the way, you can improve the situation for women. So basically, also picking up on the idea of villages within city, one of the interesting elements in future cities design is to try and design cities on a human scale with all services accessible within a 20-minute distance. 20-minute meaning either you can walk, so that's the village approach, or you can take high-speed transportation, or you use digital services. And you no longer need to go.
And that's the bar.
Yeah. So in fact, the combination of all this, the village approach, much faster transportation mechanism, in particular with the involvement of autonomous technologies, plus the possibility to capitalize on digital services, will make it much more human, a human-scale city, even if the city itself is very large, and will facilitate the lives of women.
I think on that point, I'd like to get at least 2 or 3 questions in from you. Put up your hand and we'll get the mics out to you. Anyone have any question? Put your hands up for our panel. Can we get a mic to the lady here in the front, please, if that's possible? And if you could keep your question quite short and address it to the panel, that would be great.
Absolutely. Thank you. My name is Dima Al-Hurani.
We can't hear you.
Can you hear me? My name is Dima Al-Hurani. I currently work at Pure Project. My question is about the role of urban agriculture in our future cities, the potential and perhaps not, and also the importance of changing lifestyles to consider zero-waste lifestyles, because we talk a lot about recycling, improving efficiency, but what about transforming and improving our current impact and lifestyle? So
is there anyone with another question so we can take 2 together? All right, let's take the question about agriculture. Connie, if I can get you to start.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, vertical agriculture, urban agriculture is such a great trend that we're seeing. And to feed a growing population, we're going to need the both and, right? Both urban and rural agriculture. And we need it to be in a very sustainable way. And I think it's really exciting to see the possibilities around that. And it also, again, just really helps people live where they want to live and create the life they want to live, but in a very healthy way. And I think, that's the point about the physical activity as well, and the well-being factor that we need to see in our communities as they evolve and continue to develop.
Estelle?
Yeah, on the lifestyle, I guess the goal we can have is not to target only the people who are already, the converted. So you always have, the 5% of the naturally green, they will ask, what the solutions are, whatever, blah, blah, blah. The 5% who, whatever you do, will never be convinced of changing. And the 80 or 90% in the middle. I guess, what we're trying and do when you target the city of the future is really trying to target the 90%, not only the 5% preaching to the converters. And what you can do there is two things. In terms of, say, recycling or, like environmental things, is one, explain how they can contribute, really, and the secondly, make it simple. So if I start with the first one, explain how they can contribute, you still have a lot of myth, as in, I put that in my recyclable bin, but it's going to be burned anyway in the end, so why do I do it? Or whatever. So you all have those urban myths, which we have to dispel. Having open days and, like we're trying to do and, be fully transparent, and transparency for me is the key here to try to dispel those myths. So yes, you can make a difference. So it's not only other people, it's not only your mayor, representative or whatever, or your CEO, you can make a difference yourself at the individual level, and that's what you should do. That's the first bit. I guess the second bit is making it simple. We've done, just if I'm doing into very concrete example, we've done surveys, with big population about what's practical recycling-wise, because you have some green, Ayatollah, I would say you should have 10 bins at home. One for this type of, whatever, plastic, one for the other type of plastic, a third one for glass, fourth one for whatever, and you go on and on and on and on. And, oh yeah, of course, you can think it's an ideal solution. It's not at all practical. So we've done a lot of surveys which says 3 for urban areas and 4 for, like when you have a little bit more space and you have a home, and that's it, no more, because otherwise, you will become to be counterproductive. So what we're trying and target, again, those 90%, making it simple and explain to everybody how you can actually contribute and make a difference.
Are there any other questions? We've got one in front. If we can keep it quite short because we are starting to run out of time. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm a delegate from Girls 20, and I have a question about data privacy. So the way I understand, for most smart cities, it also involves collecting data about, how people basically live their lives. So how can we ensure that, nevertheless, we don't get into like a slippery slope of collecting people's data so extensively that we're actually violating their rights?
Pascal, I think you should take that one.
Yes, this is an essential question, of course, protecting privacy and making sure that data itself is protected. Actually, a number of technology groups like Thales offer solutions, cyber security solutions, to protect this data in a very reliable way, and offer these solutions to operators that gather a lot of data, and they need to make sure that they will be compliant with the new European regulation that was implemented in May of this year, the GDPR regulation about that data protection. Technology is doing a lot, in fact, with regards to data protection. You can protect data not only as you did in the past, which was focusing on data transmitted on a network needs to be protected. Now data is protected where it is stored, and in particular for many applications, data is going to be stored in the cloud. And we really have a lot of technologies to ensure this, and we are absolutely using big data analytics and artificial intelligence to improve our efficiency in detecting potential attacks, and understand, detect an attack immediately and react immediately, but also prevent by simulating potential attacks, design patterns and solutions to protect our systems, in particular the storage systems, from being attacked. So this is an essential element, and this is why Thales is investing so much in cybersecurity, because for tomorrow, in the digital world, of course, everything will be hosted in a digital format and needs to be protected.
Just to jump in, for us as people who are making transport for you, it's absolutely key, because tomorrow every mode of transport will be connected. It is already the case, obviously, with a certain level of sophistication. But if I took, for example, the autonomous vehicle, my main concern today, it is not to running it. We have already dozens of experience, 80,000 kilometers registered. I could tell you it's working. The main issue is, first, the regulation. Who is doing what if in the system there is a, let's say, choice to make between two obstacles, human, material one, for instance, and second, the cybersecurity, because those topics are pretty serious. You can control the thing if you have not a good provider, for instance, and create big disaster. So cybersecurity for transportation is becoming absolutely strategic. The more we are doing digitalize, the more these topics will come in the middle, in the center of the security, not only the classical security that we had with metro and so on, but security of the data.
If I may ask you a question to follow up on that. The Chief Information Officer of Amsterdam said something very interesting to me about a month and a half ago. He said, we make the data anonymous to protect it. Is that what you're doing as well? Because you are sitting on a lot of data.
Yeah, absolutely. And don't forget that the regulation is messy, really messy. We have two laws in France, Loi Macron, Loi Le Maire. There is a new regulation which is still not done in the European Commission called PSI. In addition to that, obviously, GDPR is already in force since May 2018. So at one point in time, you need to align that, because there are contradictory, let's say, things in all these law material. And we need to have clarity around it, because beyond that, there is a war and a competition, to be honest, between the transporter like us and the GAFAM. Because obviously there is the security aspect, but there is also the commercial aspect of it. We are a customer-centric organization, and all the data that we have is part of our industrial property, and we need to also protect. For me, it's a key asset, the data now. It is not only the train which are staying on my balance sheet. Sorry, this part is, let's say, classical. The real asset that I have is all the data that I have in my organization, because I know a lot. Alors, yes, we anonymize, obviously, when you, I could tell you, I swear it. It is not in my organization, by the way. The data of the customer of RATP group is in a, let's say, group of a provider, and it's totally anonymous. But we need to know, by the way, if you want to design customer-centric services, you need to know your customer, and so the data are absolutely key.
A quick point from you, and then we have to go to
just a testimony. The city mayors in France, a lot of them are asking us, how do I make sure if you put everything into the cloud, it doesn't end up in the US and in the GAFA's hand anymore? So I think the real question today is as well a geopolitical one, if I may.
Well, unfortunately, we have sort of run out of time, so we are going to do a call to action here. And we are going to get our panel to give us some two takeaways that we all can go back and implement in every organization that we either work in, belong to, or are associated with. So if I can start off with you, Connie, because you can speak from a perspective, as I mentioned, that sometimes is underestimated. Give us the 2 takeaways.
Yeah, my first is an invitation to, come and join the rural conversation. We'd love to see things like autonomous vehicles, in those rural areas. So please come and help us find solutions to some of those challenges. And the other thing we'll continue to do is elevate the voice of rural as well. There's a lot of innovation happening in that space that doesn't always make it into the popular narrative. And so we need to bust those stereotypes and really, demonstrate this rural-urban, connectedness. And really the growth and sustainability together is going to be very purposeful, but also will need to happen as our world continues to change.
Pascal?
So the action items will support the vision we have, which is to create more human-centric, more inclusive cities by harnessing the power of technologies. And what I would like to really propose as action item is are targeted to involve more women in the design of future cities. More women that are coming, first of all, from the STEM domain, science, technology, engineering, maths. There are great careers for women engineers, and we need to continue to communicate very actively to convince them that they can choose this domain. It's fantastic. But second item is for other types of competencies that will represent the point of view of the user. We also need to have women that contribute to this, and we need to, and we are going to actively work on that, how to organize communication towards these other categories of people, and women in particular, to convince them of the fantastic stakes that they can work on in the field of designing cities.
Estelle?
I will have 2 calls of action, one for the men in the room and one for the women in the room. For the men in the room, can you try and convince one of your male colleagues to come to this Women Forum next year? I think it's a great success. You already have some in the room, but I'm sure we all agree we would love more. The second one for the women in the room is, you know this famous sentence, there is a specific place on hell for women who don't help other women, allegedly by an American Secretary of State. I don't know if it's true. Anyway.
It's true.
It's true. You've asked her. Okay. So we have she's a, lucky you if you've interviewed her. So basically, pick one woman in your entourage, which could be at work or at home, and try to help her stand up and dare.
Catherine?
Okay, I would say I would encourage people who have the ability to push their organization to take some, let's say, bets, be courageous, and give figures around the gas emission effect and the energy management. And in RATP Group, we have set a very, let's say, ambitious target, which is minus 50 gas emission effect by 2025, minus 20 energy management gain by the same date. It's very short, it's 7 years. We believe that we could reach that. We have the metrics and the KPI, so it's not only my purpose on the scene and I come back and it was communication setting. No. In the organization we are metrics and KPI and following this very carefully. I could tell you, if big corporates are all taking that way, it will help a lot to have an inclusive city tomorrow. Thanks.
Well, thank you to this amazing panel. This conversation will continue, I think, for many, many months. So if I can get you all to put your hands together for some of the most amazing women creating our futures, and we're putting our lives in their hands. So encourage them to do an amazing job of it. Give them another round of applause.